We all have dreams and aspirations for a life that's truly fulfilling. But what happens when those dreams are overshadowed by expectations that aren't our own?
They had no idea on what to tell me on applying to college, much less graduate school or anything like that. So I had to seek that out on my own. But things like I always had the dream to travel, to see the world. Mm-hmm. And that's not something that they had or that they knew how to foster. And again, something that seemed so risky to them.
That's Dr. Paul Rivera reflecting on his personal journey as a first-generation Latino American, navigating the complexities of cultural expectations along with his desire to forge a unique path.
I got the PhD. I got the prestigious job for them, and everything was going fine. And then I quit that job. They're like, what? It blows their mind, And actually diplomacy also has a 10-year system. And I gave that up too.
Dr. Rivera is now a renowned expert. He's been a professor, a diplomat, an economist, a strategic coach, working on projects that have impacted countless lives.
Nobody's ever seen a joint keynote, much less husband and wife doing it together. And that part has been so strangely impactful for the Latino audiences because they come from a world where men and women function in different spheres. And to see that sort of collaboration, our word for it is collective power. To see that collective power is something super impactful for them.
Now he's on a mission to help people break free from limitations and pursue their true purpose in life.
I believe that every single person, all of us, you, me, everyone, all your listeners, each and every single one of us has a superpower. Each and every single one of us has a unique way in which we go about identifying problems, solving problems, finding ways to make the world a better place.
In this episode, Dr. Rivera will share his insights on discovering your own unique superpower and aligning with your purpose, challenging traditional notions of masculinity and embracing vulnerability as a strength, and navigating cultural expectations as a first-generation Latino American. So please be sure that you're subscribed wherever you watch or listen. I think you'll really enjoy this episode. If you have a question or a topic you'd like to send me for the show, please shoot me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com. And please enjoy this interview. All right, everyone, we have a guest today. Please welcome Dr. Paul Rivera, an expert that's worn many hats throughout his career, professor, diplomat, economist, strategic coach. He's the co-founder of BeActChange, which is an organization designed to help individuals and organizations align with their purpose and maximize their impact in the world. One of the most important points for us, though, is that Dr. Rivera is a first-generation Latino American, and he has some thoughts about mental health in the Latino community, the American dream, masculinity, all of that. So, Paul, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It is a true honor to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So you have a broad set of experiences. It's almost hard to know exactly, where to start. And you've probably lived quite an interesting life because of all of that. Can you tell me a bit about sort of where your story starts? Like, where'd you grow up? What were things like for you of coming up?
For sure. Yeah. So I was born and raised in Los Angeles. Mom is from Mexico, dad is from El Salvador, and they met in the United States. So they didn't immigrate together. They met in the United States because my mom's father, so my grandfather, and my dad's brother, my uncle, worked together in the same factory, and that's how my parents met. So I grew up in LA in a very Latino household, in a very Latino neighborhood. So I actually, outside of school, never spoke English. Spanish was the language at home with my grandparents, with anybody that we interacted with. So that was really interesting. And it was a really fascinating way to grow up because you're sort of living in a world within a world in a lot of ways, and at the same time, especially back then, sort of the 70s and 80s, the big thing for families coming from Latin America, and at least in LA, in Mexico, people coming from Mexico specifically, there was a big push for having their children integrate into sort of American society. And so you get a lot of kids who now, sort of my age, who don't speak Spanish well, who don't necessarily associate that much with the culture in some ways because it was a purposeful thing, right? Their parents wanted them to come to the US and be successful and integrate. And it was one of those things that they saw it potentially as a burden to them, So I'm actually really thankful that my parents at least were not that way. My mom served as she was a translator for the LA Unified School District. So for her, the language piece was really important, right? It was really important for her that I learn both languages and learn them well, so that was.
Did she speak English prior to coming
no.
to the U.S.?
No.
Okay, so she picked it up and then became a translator.
Yeah. My mom came to the. She was pretty young, right? My mom came to the U.S. when she was 15, and kind of got thrown into the ESL type courses, and it must be the case that she picked up the language pretty quickly. But to this day, both mom and dad still have pretty heavy accents in English. My sister and I were just talking the other day that she went out with my dad and he ordered at a drive-through. And it's always been the bane of his existence to try to order at a drive-through because they
exactly like trying to hear with the accent and everything.
Exactly, he always gets the wrong thing, and it's always frustrating for him, But it was such a fascinating way to grow up because there are so many positives that came with that, right? There's the work ethic and the community and the family and the cultural piece. And I really appreciate now, especially the language piece, because I'm actually calling you from Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. And I've basically split my time, but for the last well over a decade, split my time between Latin America and the US. So just the fact that I have that language allows me to function in a way that I couldn't otherwise, But there are other things too, So our culture is a very machista culture. It's very defined in what makes you a man and what behaviors make you a man and how you should behave as a man. And then, by definition, it also tells you how a woman should behave then and how men and women should interact. And it's tough because it's something that always was really hard for me because, I was a mechanic. I have a black belt in jiu-jitsu and, I can do sort of tough guy things. I know how to fix things, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I feel very in touch with my much softer side. You know what I mean? I love literature and languages and learning.
You're an academic.
And exactly. And I love to cook. I love babies. I love the nurturing side of being a parent, which is traditionally not something that would be seen as a male masculine type way to do things. And even the way that I have my relationship with my wife, we have a very even split in terms of how we carry forth our household and that sort of thing. And it's just interesting that it's been such a struggle for that to be accepted even within our families, and it's something that we struggle against so much. And I see it in terms of the impact that it has on people, like I see a lot of Latino men, all ages, because I know that it's still happening. And you see the struggle in them, when we think about it from a little bit of a mental health perspective, you're sort of being told that this is the box that you have to fit in. And then you realize that there's a piece of you that doesn't necessarily fit in that box. So you have to make the decision of either in some ways isolating yourself a bit from your family and from your community, which sadly is kind of what I've done, right? My family's still in Los Angeles and I'm calling you from Santo Domingo. There are reasons for that.
And often it's work that is the frame for that.
That's right. That's right. And it takes a while to process all of that and come into your own authenticity and understand your value and what you bring to the world, and to realize that, who your real champions are, and it's been a really fascinating existence for me on so many levels. My family is one of the things that comes with being a sort of blue collar immigrant family is that there's a certain level of risk aversion that's there, that sounds risky. Maybe you should just, back off on that. Maybe you should just be happy with what you have, and I was a professor and I gave up my tenured job to become a diplomat, right? How do you tell your Latino immigrant family that, as far as they're concerned, you super made
it,
the
right? Thing.
You super did the thing. You know what I mean? I got the PhD, I got the prestigious job for them, and everything was going fine. And then I quit that job. They're like, what? You know, it blows their mind, you know? And actually diplomacy also has a tenure system, and I gave that up too, you know? So my concept of what is risky is very, very different than for them, you know? And honestly, for me, the real risk was staying stuck in something that wasn't for me. You know, that's the risk. That's where my physical health, my mental health, my emotional health, all of them were very much being compromised.
I want to, there's a lot of stuff to kind of follow up on here. I'm curious though, like, was there a certain point that you found that you felt a little bit different than maybe your family or like the expectations of your family?
Since the day I was born, I have always felt like black sheep is not the right word. You know, it's because they loved me. They love me. They wanted me to be happy, but they didn't know how to nurture me, how to foster that in me. And they still don't know how to relate to me in a lot of ways. Yeah. So it was very, very fascinating. You know, there's so many levels of it as I'm thinking about it. One is that I had to do things on my own a lot. Right. And it's nothing new for immigrant kids, you know, that our parents come and they don't know how the system works here necessarily. Right. They had no idea on what to tell me on applying to college, much less graduate school or anything like that. So I had to seek that out on my own. But things like I always had the dream to travel, to see the world. And that's not something that they had or that they knew how to foster. And again, something that seemed so risky to them, you know. So I was constantly having to sort of push the envelope, break the mold a little bit, and I can see all the ways in my life where I kind of picked my battles and gave in. But you know, as much as you do that, your true nature comes out somehow.
Hey everybody, quick break from our sponsor. This episode is brought to you by 23andMe Plus Total Health. I've been focusing a lot more on my physical health after some scares related to blood pressure and a horrible bloody nose situation. I've been getting serious about making some changes, weight training more, trying to find creative ways to get more cardio in my life. And what really opened my eyes is learning some family history about health situations that I was just not aware of, and I wish I was aware of much earlier. So I'm so excited to get my results from 23andMe Plus Total Health. It's not just about seeing your genetic data, it's about creating a preventative health plan tailored to your unique risks. So given what I've learned about my family's history, understanding my genetic risks feels more important than ever. With advanced genetic screening and comprehensive blood tests, I'll be able to see both my current health status and get insights into my future risks. The best part, you get to work with clinicians trained in genetics to help you build a personalized plan for your long-term health. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how these insights help me take proactive steps, and I'll be sure to keep you guys updated. If you're ready to take charge of your health as well, head over to 23andMe. It's 23andme.com/Duff for 10% off. That's 23andme.com/Duff for 10% off. Make your health personal. All right, let's get back to it. Did you have any key figures that like fostered that? Because, you know, you're getting the messaging that maybe you should, you know, just be grateful for what you have, keep it small. Yeah. Was there anybody that kind of fed that ember?
I would say that there were three people, and they didn't do it consciously necessarily. The biggest and the first was really my grandfather. So my mom's father, and he was such an interesting guy. He passed just a few years ago, but I grew up with him as a second father. Really, like my dad was always present. It was never that. But I mean, he was such a present figure in my life that I always saw him as a second father. And you know, when I was a kid, summers I would go to work with him, and he was a heavy appliance repairman. So I would go with him, and we were repairing air conditioners on skyscrapers and all of these things. And you know, I was a kid, but I was lugging all the tools and all of that. And so he inadvertently, right? But it's just the way he lived his life. He would always talk about, for example, the importance of, we call it work-life balance now, but he always talked about, you know, when we work, but then, and when we play, right? So for him, that both of those things were equally important. The pride in the quality of your work and a job well done, and at the same time, then celebrating it, you know, and so he really gave me that feeling that it doesn't have to be all work. It doesn't have to be all grind. And that was really, really important because by nature, I'm a high achiever. And if you leave me to myself, I will do that all the time, you know. Second person.
And there's like guilt, right? Like there's a guilt that comes along with recreation or something that. Like you should be working harder, right? Like don't throw away this chance you've been given.
For sure. You know, and I remember when I was a professor, the interesting thing about being a professor is that your time is basically your own, right? And I was so aware at any point that when I was engaging in leisure, that I could be, or I should be, being productive during those times. And it was a really hard thing to wrap myself around, you know. Second person that was a really big influence on me was actually not till high school, but he was the father of one of my best friends. And he was a professor at UCLA. And I had never met anybody like that, right? Nobody in my circle did work like that. Nobody around me could really show me that kind of world. So it was through him really that I first was exposed to even the concept of really what a university was and how that could be a job and all of that. So I'm always really thankful to him, Jason Frand, if he's out there still. And then the third one is super weird. Third person who was a really big, I would say almost hero mentor to me. And I don't know how old your audience is, but was Jacques Cousteau. So for those who don't know, Jacques Cousteau was basically the inventor of modern scuba. He was a French naval officer and then later explorer. And so in the late 70s, early 80s, he had this TV show called The Underwater World of Jacques Cousteau, or Undersea World. I forget which one it is now. And so he had his boat, the Calypso, and it was him and his brother and their crew. And they were just going around the world and exploring the depths and all of that. And I loved it. One, because he got to travel, and that was something that was in me from super young. But also you got to see him in these really challenging situations, and just you would see how he would approach this with calm and with reason and at the same time, curiosity and excitement, you know, and I realized that those are all things that now I value as an adult, right? The growth, the curiosity, the pushing your boundaries a little bit, which is even my shirt. My shirt says push boundaries, you know? So, you know, so, and then Jacques, one of the biggest things was that if you've ever seen him, he was a slight guy. He was really thin. He was French, you know, he's not the Rock. He's not the Rock, right? He's not the picture of masculinity that I had grown up with. And yet when you see him, he's very masculine, you know, just the way
he's invented things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And just the way he carries himself with confidence and with grace, you know, and it was a picture of masculinity I had never seen before. And I've carried with me always.
Yeah. Yes, that makes a lot of sense where, you know, you've gotten a certain type of messaging and a certain type of upbringing. There are obviously positives, negatives, I don't know, differences, right, about that. And then you, because you've had your eyes open from a very young age, you've taken in a lot, it sounds like, you know, you're able to kind of pick up on these threads from various people and figures throughout your life to kind of embrace that. That's great.
Yeah. And I mean, and a big piece of it was because I wasn't getting it at home. You know, and that's a really interesting thing to realize. So one of the things that we haven't mentioned is my nuclear family. So it was mom and dad and my sister and me. We've only recently, like in the last few years, come to understand that mom and I mean this in the clinical sense, not in the descriptive sense, is
not in the TikTok sense.
Exactly, is a narcissist. And, you know, and so she and my dad split up just a few years ago, you know, so imagine they're both in their 70s and single again, you know, but reanalyzing your life through that lens, you know, and you realize why is it that my mom, who should be my rock, you know, was never the person that I relied on or went to for emotional support, for encouragement or anything like that. And you realize that she was simply incapable of it. You know, she was so inwardly focused that she couldn't really be that for other people, you know, and it's not that there wasn't love there, but there's a limitation in terms of that capacity, you know.
The ability to actually support in a genuine way.
Correct. And that's the thing, that the support, the analysis, the ex post analysis is so fascinating of all of that, to realize that even the attempts at support were not really about you, but about making her feel better, you know, and validating herself and all of that, you know, and then the frustrating thing of, you know, one of the biggest traits of narcissism is their own inability to recognize it in themselves, right? So it's not even like you can really have a productive conversation about it with that person.
Because then you're being mean to that person.
You're being mean to that person.
Putting them
Absolutely.
down.
Yeah. So, you know.
How did looking back, you know, how did your dad cope with that? Like, did he just sort of pull away, or what was his coping?
So I mean, Dad was both her crutch and her sort of whipping boy, for lack of a better word. And to the point though, where none of us ever saw it. I mean, I'm 52, and all of this came out maybe just a few years ago, you know? So imagine they lived together half a century pretty much. And Dad always covered for her. He always covered for her, you know. So we've found out over the last few years, you know, hearing the stories, hearing the second side of the story, you know, my sister and I, we would come over and there would be something, and it looks like there had been a little bit of tension of some kind, but you know, they're couples have tension, and it went away after a while. And then to hear the other side of the story of what had actually happened before we got there, and, you know, all of that. So Dad spent all his time and energy covering for her, smoothing things over, never saying anything to us as his children, because he didn't want to damage either his relationship with us or her relationship with us, you know. So he really, it's hard to see it sometimes, you know, because on one side you realize that he really sacrificed himself for the purpose of trying to keep some semblance of family unity and harmony. But at the same time, it's hard as the child who grew up in that to not have a little bit of anger, you know, to like, I would have appreciated the honesty in some sense. You know, my sister and I remember that they went through a rough time when she and I were in high school. And we both remember at the time begging our parents to just separate. Like, this isn't working for you guys. You should really just separate. You know, we understand what's happening, and this would be better for everyone. You know, and to realize then that we were right. That's what should have happened. You know, everybody would have been much better off that way. It could have been so much more honest.
That wouldn't be necessarily the most culturally appropriate thing to do, right?
No. And in fact, in our immediate family anyway, sort of our circle, I was married once before, and I was the first one to get divorced. And that was really tragic. That was a really hard thing for folks to accept, you know, and to see, to, you know, there's on so many levels, you know, they see it as it's a failure. They see it as my parents did, that, you know, you signed the document and the document says for life. So that's what it's got to be, you know, happy or not, it's your sentence, you know, and you just have to stick it through, you know. So
religion in there too?
Yes, not as explicitly. When we were kids, my parents were not church goers, but clearly that infused their concept of the culture and what was right and wrong, you know?
Yeah. You know, so you've talked a bit about, like, you know, machismo, some various cultural factors that you've had to play against and you see other people having to sort of play against. Obviously these are things you feel like need to be kind of smoothed out in some sort of way, or at least integrated differently. What's the wrong way to do that? And what's the way that you feel like is a better approach to start kind of dismantling these things?
wrong way. I've never been asked it in that sense.
I have to imagine there are some wrong ways to go about it.
I would think so. I mean, what comes to mind first is that the wrong way is anything that involves shame. It's really hard to correct trauma by inflicting more trauma. Just because it's a different flavor of trauma, it's still not. That doesn't make it any better, So yeah. I would say that, generally speaking, would be the wrong approach. My version of the right approach goes something like this. I believe that every single person, all of us, you, me, everyone, all your listeners, each and every single one of us has a superpower. Each and every single one of us has a unique way in which we go about identifying problems, solving problems, finding ways to make the world a better place. When we ask ourselves, why am I here? What's my purpose on this earth? I think a huge part of it is that superpower is what you were given. That's the value that you contribute to the universe. And your purpose is to bring that out for yourself and in the service of others, So I think that's a big, big piece of then translating that and realizing that has no sex. It has no gender. It has no religion. It has no ethnicity, right? So I speak a lot about Latino men and machismo in general, but it's really something that applies much, much more broadly, right? So for me, the right way is, one, you start with yourself. You start with yourself and doing that work yourself to understand what is your superpower. What is it that I bring to this world? How is it that I solve problems? How is it that I contribute to the world? What is it that I want to be sought for? Like when my phone rings and somebody says, hey, Paul, I need your help. What is it that I want them to be seeking me for, right? And understanding that deeply within yourself. Once you have that, it changes your perspective on yourself. It changes the way that you speak about yourself. In our business now, we do a lot of work with all sorts of clients, from sort of college students to young professionals to seasoned people. And a huge part of that is changing the way in which they think and speak about themselves. And once you see yourself from that lens, it's so much easier to see it in others. So once you're able to understand your own superpower, you start to look for it in others. You start to value people in a much different way. And so at that point, for example, specifically in terms of thinking about men and machismo and the way in which they behave, once you start looking at a person not just by their sex, much less gender, but once you stop looking at the person in that way and you start to see them for the gifts that they bring, for the gift that they are, you can start to value them in a different way, and it changes your concept of what it means to be a man, right? So it changes your concept of what it means to be a man, for example, to one where vulnerability is a strength, authenticity is a strength, right? And it doesn't matter so much how it is that you bring that out. As long as I am being authentic to myself, this is who I am. I accept who I am. I bring these gifts to the world. And the vulnerability piece is really important also. This is something where I think Latinos really struggle, where Latino men are really harmed by the inability to show vulnerability, is massive, right? To be, and I like to think of it as, I'm so strong, I'm so confident in who I am that I can be vulnerable with you. I can open myself to you. And that, to me, is the ultimate sign of what it means to be a man, that I can tell you that. And it goes both ways. It's not just when I'm feeling bad, but when I'm feeling good. There should be nothing wrong with me showing the softness of telling my wife that I love her, but even telling my other male friends that I have love for them. You know, I recently saw this thing, you know, it's one of those stupid things on TikTok, but this guy was out there and he was interviewing men, and he was saying, I'll give you $5 if you can call a guy on your phone right now and tell him that you love him. Yeah. And he went guy after guy, and nobody, there was one guy, and it was amazing. and I'm glad to know that I have that in my life. But I think that all men need something like that, but especially my Latino men, because that's not something that we would consider normal or, within our culture.
Yeah. When you were talking about the power of vulnerability and how that's not a sign of weakness, but a sign of confidence. Yeah. I had an image of when a boxer, puts his hands down and just stands there without a guard. Right. And it's just knows that he's confident enough to not have to have that guard up.
That's right.
Intentionally being vulnerable because he knows that he's going to be fine.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And so much of that is about creating those spaces. And
so talk about that. Yeah. How do you create those spaces? How do you start, right? Because a lot of these concepts that you're saying, absolutely. But for somebody who came up kind of the way that you did, or in that same, say the same community that you grew up in, where do you start with that? Because some of that might be like, yeah, cool, buddy. Like, sure, but I got to go to work. No, for sure. How do you work your way in there?
I mean, I think there's a lot. One, I think it starts at home. I think, and as I've said it a couple of times, but the machismo is something that affects both men and women. And for all of us, the first women really in our lives are our moms, our aunts, our sisters, our grandmothers. And there's an interesting cultural thing where in Latino culture, the girls are put to work. The girls are told, your job is to work. So the girls get put to do chores and all of these things, and the boys are coddled. There's so much out there about it, but I think that that needs to change, right? That to raise confident men, to raise men who don't see themselves as entitled, to raise men who don't see themselves only within the confines of this one definition, you have to start that at home, right? So creating that independence, creating that sense of worth and sense of purpose from a very early age, I think is really, really important. Because that's foundational, it's fundamental, and that's going to carry throughout your life. And that I think is really important. So I would encourage, that sort of change at home, and really where you see it is with the moms and the sons. So there's a really interesting dynamic there. Beyond that, it's different iterations of the same thing, So like when I was a professor, I started at this university, and it was a brand new university at the time. I was founding faculty at the university, and it was in a region of California that was very heavily Latino and also heavily underserved in terms of higher education. So one of the things,
what school is this?
This was California State University, Channel Islands.
Okay.
So it's just it's north of Los Angeles, in between Los Angeles and Santa Barbara. You're where?
I'm nearby. I live in Ohio.
Okay. So yeah, exactly. I was a professor at Cal State Channel Islands for a long time. And one of the things that we did back then was that we did a lot of community outreach, going out to the local high schools and, Ventura, Oxnard, Camarillo, and all of these. And talking to the students and talking to the teachers and their parents and all of these things. The students, the young people, were all about it. They wanted to come to college. It was something that they were so happy to have that opportunity near them. But the parents and grandparents were the ones that we really needed to convince, right? A lot of them said basically that's nice, but that's not for us. This kid needs to finish high school and get a job, start making money, and I get that. Again, that's sort of the risk mentality, all of that, right? And it's the unknown for them, right? So why would you do something that's so weird and so different? So, but at the same time, that's a limitation on those young people, right? And so part of that is I think still a lot of that one at a time conversations with the families, with the parents, showing them that what the potential can be, having them understand their children in a different way oftentimes, because this whole superpower conversation is not something that we have, right? This idea of, look, this kid has this potential, this kid has this vision, this dream, this aspiration, right? You came to this country for the hope of a better future for your kids. Let him do it, And so one of the things that we see, I mean, this applies to the young men and the young women, but I see it in the young men that they get pushed into doing something career-wise that's not necessarily what they wanted to do. You know, they've sort of give up on their aspirations, and it's starting to have those conversations one at a time, really slowly. You know, that for me, the full circle moment was that I was the name reader at commencement. So I would oftentimes, after commencement, see these same parents and grandparents who 4 or 5 years before had told me this isn't for us, come back with tears in their eyes. You know, because they said, I never could have envisioned this for my son, for my grandson, but it's amazing, you know?
Yeah, that is amazing. Paul, what's your superpower?
That is, thank you for asking. Nobody asks me that.
I mean, you've been talking about it, so yeah, what's yours?
Honestly, my superpower is to see the superpower in others. And it's been a really, really powerful thing for me because I never understood it. You know, I always thought I was always somebody who I wanted to do. I felt, and I still feel this way, but I felt like my purpose was to be a positive influence in the world. Right. And so one of my first jobs was that I was a lifeguard. And, you know, by definition, you're like a positive influence as a lifeguard, right? You're doing something for somebody, you know? And then I see in my career that I've gone through different iterations of wanting to be a positive influence in people's lives. But the truth is that when I've had the most impact, when I have really felt that I was acting in a way that was aligned with me, was helping people see their own superpower. And it's oftentimes something that requires creativity, but vision, right? This seeing what this is now and what it could be, right? And it's not even, you kind of want to call it dreaming, but it's not dreaming because it's something that's within that person already, right? And it's showing them what's inside of them already. And it's been something that's given me so much joy to really be acting in alignment with that part of myself, because you see how much more authentic I can be and how much more impactful I can be when I am working specifically and explicitly with what I know is my own strength. You know, so I see the impact in people, and it's tremendous. And I will tell you that as much as I love speaking with men, young, you know, Latino men, I would say that some of the biggest impact that I have is actually working with women. Because, and I'll tell you why, because women very often in a work situation describe themselves as a set of tasks or as team players, right? And I see, so I've had the good fortune to work with so many brilliant women who are leaders, who are innovators, who are the ones who are really, really trailblazers, change makers, and they struggle because they still want to talk about themselves as team players, as nurturers, as I'm here to support, as opposed to saying I'm here to lead. So one of the biggest impacts that I've had is really working with those women to have them see the leader inside of them, to have them see that they are innovators, they are trailblazers, they are change makers, and have them start acting in accordance with what's inside of them. And you know, some of them I would say have just exploded. It's just been a tremendous thing, you know. So as I said, as much as I love working with the young men and the Latinos, working with Latinas and African American women has been some of the most powerful work I've done, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, those different people that you described, you know, African American women, Latino women, they have different set of societal pressures, right, life experience. And I think, you know, from learning how to navigate what you've experienced, you can sort of translate that, even though it's not the same, there's a certain framework for starting to navigate that in these different intersections. Yeah,
there's definitely a common foundation that we share, you know, and that's really important, because one of the other interesting features of and I've learned, I know it's true of Latin American culture, but one of the interesting features I think that we share with a lot of the African American culture is that there is a lack of trust, over the,
for good reason.
For good reason. Historically, we often feel like we've been screwed, and it's tough because sometimes the people screwing us are our own people, but there is a lack of trust there, and having that common foundation and being able to feel seen. And I think that's really important for a lot of people, that they feel not only that you share this in common, that's great, but you understand where I'm coming from and my perspective and my struggle and my dream. And that's also a really interesting one, because we come across so many people that you have to dig and dig and dig. You pick at it a little bit, and then it comes out, and they have this amazing dream that they know what it is. They know where they want to go. And there's so many things. There's the imposter syndrome, the guilt, the self-doubt, the fear, all these things that hold them back. And it's so much work to unpack all of that and sort of create the course that steers them through it, create the resilience tools that keep them on those paths, but having that common foundation is, I think, really, really essential for them to create that initial trust, because it's hard at first. I'm sure a lot of your listeners will relate, but when you first start working on yourself, it's really tough. There's a lot of things to unpack and to crack, and things that you have to.
It's daunting.
It's daunting. You have to realize things about yourself that you've never wanted to say out loud, much less, to a stranger or in front of your spouse or anything like that, So it's tough, but it is, I can't think of anything I've done in my life that's more worthwhile than that.
Why didn't you become a therapist? Why'd you become an economist / diplomat / everything else?
I will tell you. So, well, for one, I always thought that I wanted to be a medical doctor. Like I wanted to be a doctor. I was a EMT and paramedic back in the day, and I wanted to be in that world. And I think I would have been pretty good at it, but I think I'm better off where I am now. Becoming a therapist, I think one of the features of me is that I feel people's feelings and energy very, very deeply. And I think that I would struggle to disconnect myself from the client. At least that's what I tell myself, but I've become I'm a breathwork facilitator. Okay. And one of the biggest challenges that I experience as a breathwork facilitator is basically protecting my own energy. It's very easy for me to be in tune with my other practitioners and to help them connect to the energy that they're trying to connect. But in doing so, I know that I absorb a lot of it too. So I really have to very consciously put that barrier on myself so that, so I think that would carry over into my work if I had gone the therapy route.
That's fair. That's fair. I want to hear a little bit more about what you're doing right now. Yeah. So you, I think, co-founded this company. I think you also co-authored a book with your wife. Yes. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we created BeActChange, and BeActChange is really an offshoot. So my wife and I do this together. What's her name? Her name is Esther. Her name is Esther Zeladon. And she and I have very, very similar life and career paths. She was born in Nicaragua, but she came to the U.S. because there was the Civil War happening there, and her family came. She also went the PhD route. She was in academia for a while, and we met when we began our careers as diplomats. So we have a lot of parallel tracks. One of the things that we saw, especially when we were diplomats, is that we were diplomats in humanitarian assistance. So we worked a lot with communities in other countries, with government entities, and basically trying to create activities, projects that would help them in some way, development projects that would help them in some way. And what we realized was that the standard approach is a very cut and paste cookie cutter approach. So, there's an analyst that comes into this country and says, well, they need education, they need basic education, they need clean water and better governance structures, right? And so check. And so they just plug in the money and it goes. And then they realize that when the project ends, when the money ends, basically, everything goes back to how it was before. There was no sustainability. There was no uptake. There was no buy-in. And there was no buy-in because the local communities had not been consulted. This was not something that they asked for, wasn't necessarily something that they wanted. So it's gone, right? And then the agency, the US government basically is super frustrated because they're like, what? We're not having any real long-term impact, right? And so one of the things that we did in that job is that we flipped the model on its head, and we went out and initially for a year did nothing but listening. We went to communities and asked them, and what do you guys tell me? What's your situation? What are the challenges?
Imagine
that. There's a really, really fascinating guy. He comes from also international development, but on the health side. He's an Italian guy named Ernesto Ciroli, and he has an amazing TED talk that's called "Shut Up and Listen." And it's basically, it's his Italian way of telling us to do this, right? That you go out there and you go without agenda. You assume that people are smart, for one, right? And you assume that people have an idea of what's missing in their lives and what could be better. And you ask them about it and you find ways to make that happen, right? And so anyway, long story short, the hardest thing in all of that was actually teaching our people how to listen. Right? You realize that in many ways as a society, we're so focused on what's my technical expertise. Are you an economist? Are you a psychologist? Are you a water expert? Are you a governance expert? And then outside of that, people don't understand their value and don't understand necessarily how they should relate to an issue or a problem. So we had to train people on literally how to listen. And then we realized that it's a much larger problem than that. Right? People are not only not listening to each other, they're also not listening to themselves, right? And that's when it comes back to this idea of you need to understand your own superpower so you can see it in others, right? That's sort of the genesis of that model. That's when we took, as I said, that risky leap. We left diplomacy, we left the tenured job, and we struck out on our own to create BeActChange, because the whole concept is to be yourself, to act in line with it, and to change the world, right? So that's where that comes from. And so now we work a lot with, we have a whole range of clients, but we work a lot with individuals who are looking for sort of coaching type things. And we work in the coaching primarily sort of mid-career to senior professionals. We have some Fortune 500 CEOs. We have some ambassadors, actually, because of our connection to diplomacy. We have some nice connections to ambassadors as clients. And then we do a lot of work with NGOs and nonprofits. So that's sort of the world that we come from. And they're so fascinating as organizations because they're so focused on their mission that they don't always see themselves very well as business entities. They don't really know how to talk about themselves in a way that people relate to. So we do a lot of strategic planning. At the end of the day, my expertise is really in strategic planning. So we do a lot of work with them to understand their mission, vision, and purpose, creating these action plans, creating communications plans, and how it is then that they can at the same time focus on their core mission and still create the sustainability for the organization, which is some of the most fun work. Aside from that, we do a lot of pro bono work, and our pro bono work is primarily, as I said, talking to students. We do a lot of talks at different sorts of youth conferences, university level conferences, Latino DEI type conferences, and that is by far the most soul-filling work that we do, just to really get in touch with the young people and show them a picture that's different than what they could imagine. You know, actually, so as Esther and I even do a lot of corporate speaking, but all the collegiate speaking, we do it jointly. We give joint keynote addresses, which is something super unusual.
Again, another difference in how people have seen it.
Absolutely. Nobody's ever seen a joint keynote, much less husband and wife doing it together. And that part has been so strangely impactful for the Latino audiences, because they come from a world where men and women function in different spheres. And to see that sort of collaboration, our word for it is collective power. To see that collective power is something super impactful for them. And so one big vehicle for all of this for us has been the book. The book is called Creating Your Limitless Life, and it has a subtitle that says Chasing the American Dream, and it's crossed out. So one of our big themes is, and actually, as I'm talking to you today is the 1-year anniversary of the publication of the book. So that was
nice.
It's
Congrats.
Thank you. No, it's huge. It's been such an interesting ride with it. But for the purposes of sort of this podcast, we believe that the chase for the metrics of the American dream, the house, the car, the job, the material trappings of the American dream is one of the biggest things that has harmed mental health, that has harmed Latino mental health. When we talk about higher rates of severe depression among Latinos, when we talk about higher rates of suicidal ideation among Latino men, all of that can be traced back down to them feeling like they're not hitting the metrics of the American dream. So, we advocate for this whole other model, which we talked about, right? That allows people to be authentic, vulnerable, centered to their core and aligned, and to bring that out, and then the book itself has been it's such an interesting thing. The whole book world and publishing world is its own universe. Sure. It's crazy and it's weird. But we also created a workbook that accompanies it. And the workbook is both in English and in Spanish. And all three of them you can find anywhere you buy books online. And we have the digital versions available for 99 cents. And that's not a promotional price. That's our permanent price. Because we grew up as poor immigrant kids who did not
barriers
have
to access.
Yeah, absolutely. The access is essential to us, and we want to make sure that that's always there. So that's us doing our bit for it.
Amazing. It sounds like you're doing a really good thing, practicing what you preach, starting from, in these different facets. You have the individual work through the larger stuff, your book, the talking, you're doing exactly what you said, starting from, the younger age, starting from home, things like that. So that's great. I guess what I would love for you to leave people with is, I know a lot of people listening to this and a lot of people in general do feel stuck. Right? They feel, I'm imagining somebody later 30s, they're in a career, they're not happy though. They don't know what their purpose is, what their superpower is. It's not something that they feel like they're allowed to even think about. Right. Like, what's your advice for them getting started? Like, how do they start to stoke those flames?
For sure. Okay. Well, I would start with being gentle on yourself. It's a really important thing to give yourself a little bit of grace, because the fact that you are in this place means that you have busted your butt. You've given a lot, and you have to give yourself some grace. The second thing is that people always, and I think this is where people fail to start. People always overestimate what they can do in 1 year, and they underestimate what they can do in 5. So this is what happens. And this is the classic, we're getting towards the end of the year at this point. We're going to start talking about things like your goals for the new year,
New Year's
resolutions and all of that, right? Every statistic shows that pretty much by the beginning, not the end, by the beginning of March, almost everyone has given up on their resolutions. And why? One, either it's not aligned to you and you made a resolution that you didn't mean, or two, you made a resolution so high, so big for the next year that it took no time at all for you to realize that it was not something that you could accomplish. So you gave up, right? People overestimate what they can do in a year, but at the same time, they underestimate what they can do in 5. And this is, as your economist, I can tell you that compounding is a real thing, not just in money, but in life. And so I think the best thing that I can do for you is to tell you to start small. I'm not telling you, I understand you're in this situation now. You feel stuck. You hear that little voice in your head all the time telling you there's something else out there for you. There's more out there for you. And as you said, you have those voices that say you should just be happy with what you've got. And you don't want to risk losing what you've got. But that little voice inside of you doesn't go away. It's still there. It's still talking to you. You start listening to it little by little. I'm not telling you to blow up your life. I'm not telling you to, scrap everything and start over. But it's starting to find those little small pieces of alignment, whatever it is. I'll give you an example. we have a client who PhD in a sciencey science. They worked for a large pharma corporation, very successful, solid income, had a nice team, had a nice project that was going to be funded for several years. Successful person, and this was an African American woman. Okay, and yet she comes to us and says, "I feel stuck. I don't feel right. I don't feel fulfilled. I don't feel satisfied, even though I have all of the check marks, right?" And so we start unpacking her. And what comes out is that what she longs for is creativity in her life. She feels like there is a frustrated artist inside of her. And it turns out that artist happens to be a writer, right? So did we tell her, you know what? Leave your job.
Quit everything.
Leave your job, go into freelance, whatever. No, absolutely not. That's not that would be terrible advice, but it was starting to find that alignment with her. So one is, as she'd repressed it to the point that she'd never even tried it. So, we talked about signing up for a creative writing course, something that was a once a week commitment. Fine. We talked about finding ways in her job where she could engage that love of writing a little bit more. Because even on the technical side, there's places where you can start to do that. And she also wanted to be more public facing and not just a bench scientist. So we talked about how engaging with the part of the company that does outreach and things like that. So small things that start to build you up. And as you start to feel those successes, they snowball on each other. And that's what compounding is, right?
Right.
As time goes on, it's a self-reinforcing chain because it feels good and you want to do more of it. You want to find more ways to align, not just at work, but in your life as well. And that's the snowball. I mean, everything starts with taking a small step and sticking with it.
Yeah. And that's a great point about the 5 years, right? Overestimating in 1 year, underestimating 5 years. It is, a chain of those things. And those can make a huge difference if you can have that kind of patience.
That's right.
Yeah. It's been great talking to you, Paul. Is there anything else that you want to point people toward or shout out? Anything else that you haven't had a chance to say?
Just a couple small things. One is that we have if you ever want to check us out more, we have a website, beactchange.com. We have a nice Instagram that's be.act.change. You can always link with me, Dr. Paul Rivera, on LinkedIn, which is where I'm most active. We're big believers in community. One of the interesting things about feeling like we're sort of on this trailblazing journey is that people often feel alone, and so community is really important. That's something that we try to foster. So anyone should not at all feel shy or hesitant to reach out to us because we really value that community engagement. And then the last thing, if I could make a plug, the only thing is that we're trying to make the speaking part of our job a little bit larger. So whether it's we do a lot of speaking at like company ERG groups, at corporate retreats, universities, anything like that. We are super, super happy to do more of that. So if anybody's interested in that, we'd be really happy to be connected.
And they'd reach out to you on LinkedIn or something like that?
Yeah, LinkedIn is probably the best way, or Instagram, or even on the webpage, there's a link to reach us. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you for spending some time with me today. It's been a great conversation.
No, this was amazing. Thank you so much.